Good morning, everyone. We have people logging on still, so I'm going to give it a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. All right, looks like people are, for the most part, logged in. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So good morning, everybody. This is Debbie Rauscher with John Burton Advocates for Youth, and welcome to this morning's webinar, Promising Partnerships Supporting College Student Success Through Collaboration Between Basic Needs and Financial Aid Offices. I'm going to kick us off by introducing our presenters. So I am Debbie Rauscher, as I just said, Education Program Director with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Very excited to be joined by Laura Szabo-Kubicz, a consultant with LSK Advising, who has been working with JBAE on this effort, as well as Jen Sturdivant, the Director of Basic Needs from Stanislaus State, and Anna Faye Robinson, Acting Dean of Student Services at Los Angeles Pierce College. So welcome to our panel. I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are at JBAE. Before I do that, I'm just going to share some quick logistics with folks. So we are using the Q&A panel today for any questions that you may have. So we do ask that you use the Q&A rather than the chat function if you have questions. That'll just makes it easier for us to be able to track which questions have already been responded to and which ones haven't. So if folks can use the Q&A function, that would be great. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording to everyone who registered after the webinar. And we will send a copy of the PowerPoint presentation as well as the report that we're going to be referencing throughout the presentation after the webinar. So I just wanted to fill people in that you will get all of that information. A little bit about John Burton Advocates for Youth, for those of you who may not be as familiar with our organization. So we're a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco. We work across 3 areas: education, housing, health, and economic security, focusing on disadvantaged youth, primarily those who have been in the foster care system or experienced homelessness. We do this through a combination of technical assistance and training, research, and policy advocacy. And I'm just going to say a little bit about sort of JBAE's connection to this area of work around basic needs. So many of you are probably most familiar, if you are familiar with JBAE, through the work that we've done specific to foster youth. I think that's probably what we're most known for. A few years back, sort of in the context of doing that work, we really started to venture a little bit more into the basic needs space and received some funding from the ECMC Foundation a few years back to be able to do some more advocacy work in the space of basic needs. We did a report, did some different things. Ultimately, that led us to sponsor a budget request in 2021 for a $30 million ongoing allocation to support basic needs centers at community colleges. So at that point, the universities had already established some ongoing funding or were in the process of doing so, but none existed at the community colleges. So we decided to spearhead that effort. Happy to say it was successful, and there's that $30 million was increased to $40 million last year. So there's now $40 million in ongoing funding to support basic needs. In the process of doing that work, we really started to gain a better understanding of the intersection between basic needs and financial aid. And there was a lot of conversations that happened during that process about where there's overlap and what that connection should be. And so that prompted us to, this past year, really choose to dive even more deeply into this subject. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Laura, who's going to kick us off talking about the report that we worked on that, again, we will send a copy of to folks. So we're going to hear from Laura. You'll hear back from me later as well, talking about the findings from the report. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll come back and do a panel with Anna Faye and Jen, who are going to be sharing their experience on their college campuses. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A at any point. We'll either answer them in writing if appropriate, or save them and use them during the panel to pose questions to us or our other guests to get your questions answered. So feel free to send them along at any time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura. Oh, I think you're muted, Laura.
See.
There you go.
Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to have you all here. First, I'll tell you quickly a little bit about myself. Prior to starting my own consulting business last year, I worked for 14 years at TICAS, the Institute for College Access and Success, as the Director of California College Affordability. And there I worked closely with students, the higher education segments, and financial aid administrators across California, including at some of your colleges. So I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you today, and I'm so happy to be working with Debbie and Jay Bay and Anna Faye and Jen, who are with us as well. Between the summer of 2022 and winter of 2023, we conducted interviews with basic needs and financial aid administrators and staff at colleges and universities across California's 3 public higher education segments, including representatives from their systems offices. And while not exhaustive of successful approaches that institutions may be taking, this report uplifts promising practices for collaboration from 10 institutions of higher ed that are listed here on this slide, as well as strategies shared by the segment systems offices for collaboration among basic needs and financial aid offices. It's really our hope that even those institutions that have been diligently working towards these goals also operate under a framework of continuous quality improvement and can find ways based on the information shared today and in this report to move the needle even further. Next slide, please. Our conversations revealed that having system and campus leadership proactively foster a collaborative and student-centered culture has been key to forming and maintaining strong partnerships among student services, including financial aid and basic needs. At the colleges we spoke with, leadership actively encourages collaboration, develops student allies across campus, and promotes flexibility and creativity, as well as they've established a shared philosophy that centers policies directly in students' needs. Some of the policies that are helping support student success at these colleges include conducting a review of policies for any unintended bias and adjusting policies when inequities are identified. For example, colleges can use data to evaluate if any student groups are disproportionately impacted by financial aid verification or satisfactory academic progress policies. Colleges also can repeal any unnecessarily punitive administrative policies. For example, putting holds on financial aid if a student has an unpaid balance from something as minor as a overdue library book, and any other policies that are created in the name of holding students accountable, but which unfortunately can really impede their success. Next slide, please. Many institutions that we spoke with successful partnerships have also convened a committee across college departments that meets regularly to identify solutions and maximize resources. It's really important that this type of committee include the many departments that impact student success and provide resources to students, such as financial aid, basic needs, academic counseling, mental health, and categorical programs, as well as students whose firsthand experiences are critical to informing the policies that will best serve them and their peers. It's also critical that these committees develop processes for responding quickly to students in crisis, which can be facilitated in part by creating a basic needs assistance forum to serve as a single point of entry to the multiple programs, including basic needs emergency fund, so that students don't need to figure out on the front end which resources they may be eligible for or submit multiple duplicative applications. And to ensure policies and practices evolve with students' needs on a regular, so at least annual basis, these committees should really reevaluate their mission, policies, and procedures to ensure they continue to be student-centered. Next slide, please. We also found through our conversations that identifying a designated liaison to support partnerships between basic needs and financial aid has many benefits. These include supporting cross-promotion of financial aid and basic needs programs, including through student-facing forums, proactively identifying students who could benefit from available support, and promoting enhanced information sharing so students take advantage of available resources that they may not know about. Liaisons can also function as a sort of help desk for student services staff who are assisting students with financial aid. Now, to ensure that liaisons are fully empowered to carry out their role, it's really important that they're given the authority to develop and advance policies and procedures that streamline student service access, and also that they're authorized to authenticate a student's circumstances when seeking to modify financial aid eligibility, such as through professional judgment, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. Next slide, please. Data systems also play a key role in identifying which students could benefit from additional support. Some of the ways that the schools in our report leverage data systems to maximize resources included giving basic needs staff, including liaisons, viewing access to permissible financial aid information, such as whether a student has filed a FAFSA or a California DREAM Act application, CADA, and using data to proactively identify and award students before they hit a crisis. So for example, some of the colleges in our report have developed automated systems that alert staff via their billing system when students are behind on rent and student housing, so that staff can offer support to help get students back on track before they get into more of a problem with paying for their housing. Some of the schools have also run rosters of students who are likely eligible for CalFresh, such as those who receive Cal Grants or who have work-study eligibility. And then they proactively reach out to these students and share information about available resources. So by identifying who is accessing which programs and at what frequency, colleges can have a more complete sense of where students are struggling, as well as use the data they gather to help inform the development of accurate cost of attendance budgets. Next slide, please. Additionally, providing opportunities for offices to communicate about their respective roles and programs, available tools, and the challenges they face helps create a space to jointly problem solve to best serve students' needs. This can be done in multiple ways, including through regularly inviting specialized programs to give staff updates and answer their questions about programs and operations, training staff across offices on their processes and procedures, such as dependency overrides and cost of attendance appeals, so that they can help guide students through them, identifying and utilizing multiple touch points to reach students and share information, such as through orientation, course enrollment, and partnering with faculty and staff who are on the front lines. Additionally, when requests for emergency aid are made to basic needs centers, instituting a policy that allows the financial aid office to rely on the information provided by the basic needs staff to process a request without requiring any additional confirmation or documentation or verification helps ensure students get the resources they need without delay. Now I will turn it over to Debbie.
All right, thanks so much, Laura. I'm just going to say, before I kind of jump into the remainder of the recommendations, provide a little bit more context for the report. So, I know Laura went through those first 5 recommendations pretty quickly. There's a lot more information in the report itself that we didn't cover here. So I would encourage people, as I said, we will send the report out, and I do encourage people to take a look at the full report, because there's a lot of examples and suggestions and things in the report that I think hopefully will be helpful. We also, I'll just call out in the report, you can see on the slides, we're kind of calling out some specific policy ideas. And we do have a pullout section in the report that's very focused on actual policy changes that can be made at your institution to strengthen coordination across basic needs and financial aid, and adopt policies that really support students who are experiencing basic needs insecurity to get access to all the resources that may be available to them. And so we really try to kind of keep a balance in the report and in what we're presenting here between more programmatic suggestions for things that you can do, and then actual policy ideas. And so we encourage folks to really look at both of those as you think about whether there are ideas in what we're presenting here that are relevant to the work that you're doing. Oh, and it looks like Laura just put the report in the chat. Good thinking, Laura. It occurred to me. So yes, the report is in the chat. We will send the link out afterwards, but you can also take a look at it. Okay, so moving through the rest of our recommendations. The next recommendation is strengthening coordination between the two offices to ensure students receive all benefits for which they are eligible. So we know that there's a lot of students eligible for things like CalFresh who don't actually receive those benefits. And so there's a lot of ways that through collaboration, there can be more opportunity for students to get access to these kinds of benefits. So for example, we know that CalFresh in particular is kind of an ever-changing landscape in terms of who's eligible as a college student. There were some temporary provisions as a result of the pandemic that are now being changed. The state has been enacting additional legislation. So it's really important that staff really are trained both within financial aid and within the basic needs centers to understand exactly what the exemptions are for students to be able to qualify if they're not working part-time per the kind of student rule that we won't get into the details of now, but there's just a lot of complexity around that. In addition, in the state of California last year, actually, a bill was adopted, AB 2810, which requires every CSU and community college to use data from the FAFSA to identify students who are likely to meet the income qualifications for CalFresh, and then to outreach to these students via email. So this is something that now it's a best practice and a recommendation, but it's actually now a law as well. So we certainly encourage everybody to take a look at that and figure out what processes you want to put in place if you haven't done so already to let students know that they might qualify for CalFresh. I'll just offer an example from Mount San Antonio College, one of the colleges that was interviewed for the report. So at the beginning of every semester, the financial aid office runs a report to see which students appear to meet CalFresh eligibility criteria, and then emails them a letter that was created by the basic needs staff with information about how to apply for the program and how one qualifies. The email, this is kind of an interesting bonus at Mount SAC. The email also includes a notice to county officials that serves as evidence that the student qualifies for an exemption to the requirement that students have to work 20 hours per week. They reported to us that before they put this process in place, they had about 20 to 30 students per term who were applying for CalFresh. And now as many as 350 applied during a single semester, with probably about half of those students actually receiving benefits. So this kind of communication really can make a huge difference in leveraging something like CalFresh. A couple of other ideas that came up as policies that were in place at some of the institutions that Laura spoke with. One is having a policy to automatically provide any student who identifies themselves as housing insecure or experiencing homelessness with a request for a change in dependency status. So students who are homeless typically qualify for independent status on the FAFSA, which can increase the amount of funding they get through financial aid, but many of them may not know about that option. And so if somebody identifies themselves as homeless, to make sure that they're connected to that opportunity through financial aid can be a great way to leverage additional resources for the students. Another idea that came up was dedicating financial aid office hours specifically for students utilizing basic needs services. So again, you know, these students are often in a position where they're sort of the least likely to be able to wait in line to talk to financial aid, or maybe they don't have access to a computer consistently because they're unhoused or something like that. And so having some dedicated financial aid office hours to make sure those students can really easily talk to somebody in the financial aid office to make sure they're getting all of their benefits is crucial. You know, state funding is limited, and so we want to make sure that every student is getting every benefit, in particular federal benefits, Pell Grant, CalFresh, and you know, state programs that are more robustly funded, like the Cal Grant program, before we turn to the very scarce basic needs funding that's typically available. The next set of recommendations covers some specific policies related to maximizing access to financial aid. So there's kind of some sub-recommendations underneath our recommendation 7, so A, B, and C. So I'm going to walk through each one of these. And again, these are more focused kind of specifically on financial aid policies and how financial aid policies can be put in place to address student basic needs. So the first is just ensuring students receive all the financial aid for which they are eligible. So we know, one thing that's always sort of interesting to me is when I look at some of the data that's available, specifically at the community colleges, I see a big gap between the number of students who receive the Promise Grant, the fee waiver, and the number of students who receive a Pell Grant. And so there's a lot of reasons that contribute to that gap, but one of them is that students don't have to complete the FAFSA process in order to get the fee waiver, whereas they do have to complete that to get the Pell Grant. And so every time I see that data, I'm reminded of the fact that there are probably a lot of students out there, especially at the community colleges, who could be getting a Pell Grant, Cal Grant, you know, other sources of aid, who maybe are missing out simply because they didn't have the support they needed to make it through the FAFSA process. So really making sure that students are provided adequate support can go a long way. Also, regularly combing through financial aid files to ensure that students are receiving all the financial aid to which they are entitled before turning to emergency funding. So if a student is coming in and requesting emergency funding, the first step can be to take a look at their financial aid file, to have somebody within the financial aid office that you can easily contact to assess, has this student actually submitted a FAFSA? Maybe their financial aid is being held because of a verification step that they didn't complete or something like that, making sure that all of that money is being made available. Again, you know, the emergency funding we know is in short supply, so we want to spread that out as far as possible by leveraging other sources of funding. And then examining how information about financial aid is being made available to students. So is it being made available in different communication modalities? Do you have information on your website in different languages? Do you have expanded office hours that allow students who are working to be able to access a financial aid counselor during non-traditional hours? These are all ways to make financial aid more accessible to students. A couple of policy ideas. If your campus has a policy that you automatically drop students if they have a balance due on their student account, we would strongly encourage campuses to eliminate those kinds of policies. There's a lot of campuses I have already started to eliminate those types of policies, but some still have them in place. If you're one of the campuses that still has a policy like that, taking a look at that to see how necessary that actually is. And then this is something that's more applicable at the CSUs, proactively repackaging students' financial aid throughout the year. So if students who were awarded, say, state university grant funding, end up not enrolling and that funding doesn't go to them, to continuously look and see, is there additional funding that's been made available, and can we fill in some of the gaps in unmet need with funding throughout the year as more funding kind of is recycled or becomes available in some way. So the next financial aid recommendation is to make use of options to exercise professional judgment. I'm sure anybody who's on this call who works in financial aid is familiar with professional judgment. Probably most of you on this call are familiar with professional judgment, but this is the flexibility that colleges have to look at a student's individual circumstance and make exceptions to some of the more blanket rules. So the first thing is just making sure students are aware that they have the option to request a change to their financial aid based on professional judgment. And the graphic there, this is a graphic that I found online from a campus that's not actually based in California, but I really liked it. This was really prominent on their financial aid page. Does the FAFSA reflect your family's current financial reality? If not, you may have an opportunity to appeal, exclamation mark. It's encouraging students to let the financial aid office know where there may have been changes so that they can do that appeal, rather than kind of only the students who manage to figure out that that's even an option have access to that option. So advertising it, making sure students know about it. Guiding and support students through the PJ process. It's not always that easy or straightforward to find the documentation, that type of thing. So, having staff available, whether it's in the financial aid office or through the basic needs centers, to support those students through the process, and not overly limiting which special circumstances qualify for professional judgment. Institutions do have quite a lot of flexibility in this regard. And I know that sometimes there's a tendency to lean towards being more limited rather than more expansive because of fears about, well, what if we're audited, that type of thing. The information that we've always received is, as long as you're following your institution's policy and you've documented the basis for your determinations, you will be fine when it comes to an audit. So, don't let fear get in the way of putting students first. In terms of policy ideas, the recommendation we have is to create a policy that when third-party documentation is not available, that the financial aid office documents the student's circumstances, and this serves as the documentation. And this is absolutely allowable to do this. And just as an example, there was a student that I was having a conversation with who was in a situation where they were requesting a dependency override. They weren't homeless, they weren't in foster care, they didn't qualify for automatic independent status. They were requesting a dependency override based on the fact that their family had been quite abusive. But it hadn't been documented. There hadn't been calls to CPS, that type of thing. But it was clear from, just what they were reporting that this was a circumstance where it was creating a safety risk for the student to have to try to get their family to fill out the FAFSA. And there was no third-party documentation. Like, it just wasn't practical for them to be able to identify something to document that circumstance. In that kind of situation, you as a financial aid officer absolutely can write down, you could have the student sign attesting that, yes, these are my circumstances and it's true. And that serves as your documentation and for you to be able to approve the professional judgment. And again, as long as you have that in your policy, your local policy to do that, and you've written down exactly what your basis was, that is adequate in terms of what the Department of Education requires if you do end up in a circumstance of an audit. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about satisfactory academic progress, and I'm going to spend a little extra time on this because this is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. For those who follow along with what work JBay is doing. We've been working on the issue of SAP for a couple of years now, done 2 reports, which is with a 3rd in the works. We're actually doing a bill related to satisfactory academic progress this year. We did a whole learning community. So anyway, got lots to say on this, but I'll try to keep it relatively brief. The reason we're so focused on SAP, and just for those who aren't familiar with the term, students have to maintain a certain GPA and complete a certain percentage of their attempted courses in order to maintain eligibility for financial aid. This applies to both federal financial aid like Pell Grant, as well as state financial aid like the Cal Grant. Students who do not meet that standard for 2 consecutive terms typically lose access to financial aid. Campuses can provide students with an opportunity to appeal. We at JBay did some research where we were able to obtain data from the community college system and looked at what percentage of students likely were failing SAP for 2 consecutive terms. And what we found was, number one, almost a quarter of all students at community colleges lose their financial aid after their first year. So we were looking at first-year students receiving a Pell Grant. So that's a huge number. And this is why we're so focused on this, because so many students are losing their financial aid because of SAP standards. Also, we found that there are big disparities based on race and ethnicity. So you can see that Black and Native American students have the highest rates of SAP failure. It's double that of white and Asian students. Hispanic students also have very high rates of SAP failure. So there's a lot of disparities. When you look at, there was an interesting qualitative study that was done that looked at the differences between students who made SAP versus those who do not. And what it found was that it was not a difference in motivation or drive or commitment to their education. The differences between students who did or did not make SAP was really about things like having more life responsibilities. So students who fail SAP are more likely to be student parents and have childcare responsibilities, full-time employment. They also had fewer resources, whether that was not having reliable family support, maybe not having reliable transportation. They experienced basic needs insecurity. They didn't have, say, a flexible work schedule, whereas a student who does make SAP maybe did have a more flexible work schedule. They didn't have the cultural capital to help them understand how to navigate college. And they were more likely to have experienced feelings of powerlessness, typically from having childhood experiences like homelessness, child welfare system involvement, abusive family situations, et cetera. And so, what SAP policies often end up doing is they take the students who are coming in with the greatest barriers and then further disadvantages them by eliminating their access to financial aid. So what we found further in the work that we have done around SAP is that institutions perhaps don't always understand how much flexibility they actually have under federal law in terms of their SAP policies. So we actually looked at all 150 policies across all 3 public systems, compared it to what the federal law requires, and found that in practically every circumstance, there was at least one policy that was more stringent than is required by federal law. And so there's a lot that institutions can do, and we have a whole report on this. I'll send that out after the webinar as well. But a few things that we have found in policies that I would suggest you take a look at if your campus is doing this. One is you're only required to evaluate cumulative measures. You don't have to look at individual term measures as well. If your campus is looking at individual term measures in addition to cumulative measures, that's a policy that you can perhaps revise. Does your SAP policy allow for multiple appeals if necessary? We do see policies that say you can only appeal once in a lifetime or maybe 2 times. And the reality is, one term, a student may be in a car accident, and the next term, their mother dies. Things happen more than once in the lifetime of a student. So creating flexibility to allow for that. Providing for a broad range of circumstances that can qualify a student to appeal. Some policies limit it to just death of a family member or injury or illness. whereas you can actually define quite a broad range of circumstances to approve for appeals. Not requiring third-party documentation. Again, I'll just give you another example of one of our own youth advocates who's been working with us on the bill, talks about how she was in a domestic violence situation 3 years ago. It ended up resulting in her failing SAP, dropping out of school. She tried to return to college, to community college 3 years later, and was told, you have to provide us third-party documentation of the domestic violence situation that happened 3 years ago in order for us to reinstate your financial aid. And she was like, I don't know how to do that. Like, I didn't report this at the time. Even I just fled and slept in my car with my baby, and she wasn't able to get her financial aid back. So being flexible in that type of circumstance, allowing students to maintain their aid as long as needed, as long as the student is complying with their academic plan. Some campuses say 2 terms, and then if you're not back on SAP good standing, we're cutting you off your financial aid again. Sometimes that's mathematically impossible, depending on how low the GPA is that a student is coming in with. And then making your policy accessible on your website by providing student-friendly language. And again, we have a couple of reports that go into a ton of detail about this. So I'll send those out if people want to dive more deeply into the SAP issue. Okay, and then the next issue is cost of attendance. This just seems to be coming up more and more and more in the conversations that I'm having, where students have to turn away aid. And a lot of times basic needs emergency aid because they've hit their cost of attendance limit. So making sure those cost of attendance budgets are accurate, making sure students know about all allowable costs. So if they have childcare costs, those can be included in cost of attendance if they have expenses related to a disability. And then again, using professional judgment to adjust students' budgets to accurately reflect their expenses whenever that is warranted. In terms of policy ideas, streamlining the cost of attendance appeals process, moving it to an accessible online form if you don't already have that, without administrative barriers, to make it as easy as possible for students to request those adjustments. And I know that both LA Pierce and Stanislaus State shared policies with us related to cost of attendance adjustments. So I'm not going to steal their thunder. I'll let them talk more when we get to the panel part about what they've done. And then the last financial aid related policy is minimizing the verification burden. So supporting students to navigate the verification process if they're selected, assisting them with the documentation, identification, and completing the form, and then having multiple pathways for students to submit their documentation. So we know a lot of students fall out of the financial aid process because they're flagged for verification and then don't make it through that process. So in terms of policy ideas, only verify applications selected by FSA or where conflicting information exists. It's not necessary to verify any students who don't fall into one of those 2 categories. And some institutions do choose to verify additional students. So we encourage you not to do that, and not requiring any information or documentation beyond what is requested by the feds, making it as easy as possible for students to keep their financial aid. And I'm just going to, before I move on to the next recommendation, I'll say something, just sort of my philosophical thinking around all of these financial aid issues, because I know sometimes we'll bring up, well, what about if we don't require documentation, if we do accept students' word, that type of thing, what about the students who then get away with it, who are lying, who are gaming the system to get access to more financial aid? And that happens. Those students exist. I'm not going to pretend like that never happens. The way that I look at it personally is you end up kind of having to err on one side or the other. So either you err on the side of really being, very fastidious about verifying every single thing and making sure nobody slips through and gets financial aid who shouldn't. And the trade-off you have is a lot of students who should get their financial aid who end up not getting it because they can't jump through the hoops. On the flip side, you might have, if you err towards creating a more flexible process, you have to accept that that means, there might be students who get financial aid who maybe shouldn't have. But we know that those students who can't jump through the hoops and get over those hurdles are our students of color, our student parents, our low-income students. And so in terms of supporting equity, erring on the side of being more student-friendly and more flexible is the path that typically leads to more equitable outcomes across different student populations. So moving on to some other opportunities for collaboration. Housing your basic needs department and financial aid within the same division so that they're reporting to the same supervisor and their guiding vision, which can help to facilitate collaboration. Doing this also enables the streamlining of resources so that there can be a more seamless handoff between departments. It's easier to assist the students to navigate and maximize available supports and eases communication. It also can help facilitate joint programming, so you can do outreach events jointly together between financial aid and basic needs. And if they're both housed under your student services or student affairs division, it also can be helpful in connecting students more seamlessly to other resources that may be available within those divisions. Number 9 on our list of recommendations, and this is the last one before we get to our panel, is hiring staff with backgrounds in student services and student affairs or backgrounds in social work. So this really helps to ensure that policies and practices are designed to really understand the different challenges students face. So somebody who has worked in student affairs, who has a social work background, has had that training, is coming in with a certain kind of understanding about how complex the lives of these students can be. These staff often also bring more comprehensive understanding of the other resources. So if they've worked in the community, they'll know about the homelessness programs, the food pantries, the mental health support, et cetera, and kind of come in able to hit the ground running to make those kinds of referrals. And collaborating with your mental health support and social services agencies is also a way to kind of bring that knowledge in-house. And so if you have staff who maybe don't have those backgrounds, to collaborate with outside agencies or with your internal mental health practitioners to help your staff develop those kind of social work skills and understand and have this recognition of how complex it can be. Okay, so before we move on to the panel, I'm going to kind of introduce our panel in a second, but Laura, I'm going to turn it back over to you to say a few more things before we launch into the panel.
Yes, I was so excited to get into the report that I forgot to give kind of a bit of a preamble at the beginning, which is that, what was so wonderful about having the conversations with all of the financial aid and basic needs administrators and staff was just to really hear about all of the experiences and creativity that had went into kind of reevaluating the policies and practices that they had on their campuses and thinking about, okay, what is it that we can do differently to really serve students better and also to like help work more seamlessly with one another, right? Make our jobs easier. And so I think, this whole package of recommendations, what we're really hoping is that, certainly at the very least that it sparks conversation that for some of you, you might be at colleges and universities where there isn't partnership yet. And hopefully, it will encourage you to reach out to one another and to just kind of start having those conversations to get to know each other. But also, for those of you who already have the partnerships, to continue to do that great work. And ideally that some of these ideas here will spark even further innovation. So I just wanted to mention that I know there's a range of what colleges and universities are currently doing. And hopefully this will be a resource for all of you. So I just had wanted to mention that a bit delayed. I think you're muted, Debbie.
Thank you. So we're going to launch into the panel. So I'm happy to introduce Jen Sturdivant. She's the founder and director of Basic Needs in the Division of Student Affairs at Stanislaus State, and she's served in that capacity since 2019. She oversees the Warrior Food Pantry, food distribution, CalFresh, temporary housing emergency grants, and student case management. She also has over a decade of experience working with nonprofit, community, and public agencies. She has also served since 2020 as the co-chair for Basic Needs at the CSU Office of the Chancellor. And Anafe Robinson is currently the acting dean of student services. She oversees financial aid and special projects at LA Pierce College. She has over 30 years of financial aid experience. She has served as the president of CASFA and CISFA, our two financial aid associations, and has served in a number of different leadership capacities. So we're really excited to have both of them. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share so that you can see all of us. So I'm going to start with Jen. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you and your campus to go down this path of exploring ways to have better collaboration between basic needs and financial aid?
Yes, definitely excited. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here with you all and to talk about the wonderful work that our financial aid office in partnership with our basic needs team has really been able to accomplish. And some of the things that inspired us to identify ways to work together was in 2019 when I had started our emergency grants program was emerging, right? So it was starting to gain more traction. And so we had that ability to work together more frequently, that we need to figure out how can we get students awards and emergency funding in the most seamless way possible. And so so grateful that both the financial aid, the director and the assistant director were really open to a collaborative approach of streamlining administrative barriers. So we were really looking at, okay, these are the scenarios that we are working on together. How do we get students these much needed funds in the quickest way possible so that it was like this seamless transition and that we were really trying to figure out a process that would better serve our students. So that was one of the main things that kind of kicked us off together. And then we, went into a pandemic. And so those conversations that we were having really, we started having them every day, right? Like the world definitely changed for us. And so emergencies were everywhere. Our numbers skyrocketed, emergency grants. And so that it was both that need and the timing, right? And openness to work together.
Great. And I'm going to put the same question to you, Anafe. What inspired you and your campus to work together?
Well, again, we are here because it's for our students, right? We're here at our colleges and our roles because we're here to serve our students. Well, it kind of started before the basic needs funding actually came about. I went to actually, I was wondering whether it was a CISFA or CASFA conference where I think it was you, Debbie, you were, or somebody else was, the topic was about CalFresh. And so I reached out to that individual, and that's how we started our CalFresh program here at Pierce. And I had that in my office, in the financial aid office. But due to some of, I don't call it barriers, I call it challenges when it comes to space and staffing, then we moved it to the Student Engagement Center, where, again, they have a little bit more space to house the CalFresh program. And then we have the basic needs funding. And then that's how it came about. We have the basic needs coordinator that we hired. The college allocated space. And we're fortunate that the basic needs coordinator is, I've known this individual for many years. So we just continued that relationship. So we're fortunate that we continue to find ways to help our students. So for example, I know you talking about collaboration. and reaching out to students about financial aid. So one of the things that we are doing is that we partner with our basic needs coordinator, or what we call also our Brahma Bodega, which is our food pantry. We partner with them on a weekly basis when they hold their market, I guess, and if you want to call that, or their fresh food, and they did, they distribute food to the students. So we partner with them, and we have the financial aid office right next to them, their booth, and then we also include our career closet. So all of those basic needs type of things that are in one event. So, and then in addition to that, to enhance that further, we are going to send staffing to the Basic Needs Center once a week, so that if there's any questions about financial aid and the basic needs, at least someone is there. And this is also going to help us with our financial aid outreach as well, because we still, while we send communication to students and encouraging them to apply for financial aid, you still have those students that just don't want to do it, or they're afraid. So if we're out there where we go out and see, where the students are, then hopefully that would encourage the students to complete that FAFSA and learn more about the different types of financial aid funding that's available, not just well, you said, Debbie, not just the CCPG, but other federal and state funding that could help them with housing, food, and many other expenses that goes along with going to school.
Great, thank you. So Jen, talk about what you have found to be the most helpful in facilitating the partnership between financial aid and basic needs.
There's probably been a few key things that have really been successful for our partnership. Definitely regular meetings, talking through new legislation or state funding or things that come out, and we make a plan together. We get new funding, we sit down, we talk it through, and we look for some strategies, and we're also willing to adjust if that first attempt doesn't quite work out like we'd had imagined, right? So it's really that flexibility and communication with one another. And we also cross-train our staff. And so that's been really helpful for us. So when our basic needs folks are working with a student in a crisis, they've built that rapport, they are made the connections with the student, they're able to, support the student potentially with a cost of attendance adjustment process. They're able to work through that form with the student and go through, answer some preliminary questions, and really having clear lines. If we have questions that come up too with financial aid, we know exactly who we're going to. We have Teams chats. Our basic needs lead, he is constantly Teams chatting our financial aid director and assistant director, and they're very responsive and so helpful for us. And we also have a smaller working group that is focused just around our emergency grants process. And so financial aid serves on that working group as well. And we also have a larger basic needs committee where the financial aid team is on that as well. So we have a few different strategies and open lines of communication that have been really successful for us.
Great. And how about you, Anna Faye? What have you found to be most helpful?
Again, it's just that being flexible and have that, like Jen said, clear lines of communication. So if the basic needs center have a question, all they do is either, again, we use Teams chat a lot. That's like the best tool ever, right? Because I may or may not be in my office, but I have the Teams chat on my phone. So I could be anywhere and it could still respond to any inquiries. And also, in addition to that, we're actually creating, now that we're sending staffing at the basic needs, we're going to create a Teams chat specifically for basic needs and that staff and many of the staff here who could answer all of those questions, right? So, so yeah, utilize your technology, right? Not just phone calls and things like that, but utilize technology to help you. So yeah, it's just that, again, if they have questions, just, contact us, right? And it's also up to us, right, to initiate that conversation. I know we were talking earlier when we were meeting to plan this about, there are colleges or, areas where it's just difficult to start that, but sometimes it's up to us to initiate that. So instead of just sending an email to introduce yourselves, why not visit and maybe go grab coffee or, just just start that conversation, and then hopefully that they will warm up and you can start talking. And sometimes it's good to have the face and the name. And so for me, my relationships that I built within the campus took years. It's a lot of walking and visiting offices. So now if I do need to make a phone call, at least I know, oh yeah, it's Santa Fe, they know who I am now. So you have to take the time and invest in that walking and talking and building relationships.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question, there's a couple questions that came up in the chat, and another question that just came in related to cost of attendance. And I'm going to actually go ahead and say something about cost of attendance myself to answer that, which is that because this seems to be coming up so much, it's on our radar at JBay to take a more comprehensive look at how this is done across the systems and the institutions. So we are most likely going to be doing some research in the coming year to look at cost of attendance numbers, what the variation is across cost of attendance numbers, in particular, the housing numbers and how those compare to actual, other data sources related to housing. And, as is often the case with what we do here at JBay, a lot of times the research we do does lead to legislation eventually. So not saying that this would or wouldn't be the case for this particular issue, but there is a question that just came in about other talks about creating regulations related to cost of attendance. And there are talks here at JBay, at least internally, about taking a look at that issue more comprehensively. So more to come on that. The next question is for Anna Faye, and I see that something just went wrong with your video, but that's fine. We can see your lovely photo. So as long as your audio is working, we're good. Oh, now you're back. Great. Can you talk a little bit about how you utilize tools like professional judgment and SAP appeals to help ensure students have access to financial aid? And how does this flexibility help students to navigate the financial aid process?
Yeah, Debbie, like you said earlier, PJ is our friend. I mean, we have a lot of leeway and flexibility and authority when it comes to professional judgment. PJ means professional judgment for those of you who are not in financial aid, on things like a satisfactory academic progress, which is SAP, and other income-related type of professional judgment. So what we're doing here with our foster youth, for example, right, our foster youth population, our Guardian Scholars program, and next up, it's in a different office. We used to have the Guardian Scholars in financial aid, but because of staffing and things like that, we transferred it to the EOPS office. So what happens is that if there are students that are disqualified, let's say foster youth is disqualified, they would see their counselor at the EOPS office or next up. And then the next up or Guardian Scholars coordinator notifies our financial aid liaison who's in my office. And then what we do is we prioritize them, because we know that funding sometimes is oftentimes is hard to come by for these populations, especially our foster youth. So, it's we have that flexibility, we prioritize them. And as far as documentation, sometimes, as long as, like you said, Debbie, as long as you have documentation that you could use to what I call defend your decision, then, you you may just include, accept a statement from the student. Again, when you develop policy here in financial aid, develop policy that is a little bit open. You could always suggest, for example, professional judgment. You could always suggest, documentation include, let's say, tax returns, right? Letter from a third party. But then you always have that and other, and others, right? So it can't just be those things that's listed. You have to make it a little bit more open so that us financial aid professionals have the flexibility to accept a different type of documentation, not just what you just listed.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A about SAP. And so the first one, I mean, I think either one of you can answer this actually. They're asking about what are the reasons that you see that students run into SAP challenges? I mean, I will just say that there's no data on this. And so this wasn't something that we were able to include in our report because it's not tracked in any kind of comprehensive way. So I'm just curious though, anecdotally, either Jen or Anna Faye, what do you see just in your personal experience as what's going on with these students in general?
For us, we've seen a lot of family situations, not just academics. Yes, that happens too. And when it comes to academics, it could be, we've seen that they have reached their limit, what we call the maximum time frame, because again, the regulations for financially is that they should be completing their program within 150%. And so they've reached that or they're over that. So they're taking classes that are not necessary. So that's why upfront, these students, they need to be counseled right away, right? So they can follow their plan. And others could just be family situations. Again, students just moved out of the house because there are some arguments between the parent and the student or things like that, or unfortunately death of a family member, which then affects the entire family, or the students, especially these days, the students have to contribute to the household when it comes to expenses. And so a lot of our students are working at least 30 hours a week, and then they're going full time. And sometimes students are working 2 jobs. So unfortunately, it does affect their academics. So that's what we're seeing a lot, especially these days when touch on it, Debbie, about the housing cost, right? Or just any expenses for that matter. Food now is increasing, gas, transportation. So they're contributing to the household as far as expenses, and that really takes a toll on the student, because then instead of concentrating on academics, or concentrating on working to help pay for expenses for the family.
Yeah. Jen, anything you want to add to that from your experience?
Yeah, through the basic needs lens, right? It is those family experiences, death in the family, potentially mental health pieces that their struggles their students are experiencing, a variety of layers. Each student has their own story, and they are more than just students, right? They're parents, they're caregivers, they come from homes of intergenerational poverty, multi-generational households. So our students are amazing, and there are also many, many layers. And so there could be a variety, and I see probably more of the personal side of the house through the process. So
yeah.
Debbie, can I add something
Yeah,
about
of course,
professional
please.
judgment? I know I had an example, and I think more than once, but I had a student who came to me. This was many years ago. The student is under 24, so the student is considered a dependent student. The student is part of the LGBT community, but the parents are very traditional. So there was always infighting, and unfortunately the student got kicked out of the house. So again, those kinds of things where there's flexibility for us. And then, like you said, Debbie, some of the policies say you must have third party, but right, all of those documentation. But maybe, again, this is where the flexibility comes in and say, okay, I need a statement from the student, at least explain I met with the student, and maybe a statement from a friend or something like that, because the student unfortunately had to couch surf, right? At risk of being homeless. So this is where you could be more flexible and just say, and I the student can't have a third party documentation from a doctor or a priest or anything like that, right? Or a social worker, because again, this is a little bit different. So we need to start thinking about that, because we're here again to help the students, right? So as long as it's your judgment, right? It's our judgment, and I know that the student is telling the truth. I could just feel it, because again, there's lots of tears and during the conversation. So
Yeah.
Can I hop in to add one thing to this as well?
Of course.
I also, in addition to students coming forward requesting SAP appeals or professional judgment or dependency overrides, I think there also are instances of campuses where they are proactively identifying students who could benefit from those tools. So for example, at one school, actually it's Long Beach City College, students who identify themselves as housing insecure or homeless are automatically provided with a request for change in dependency status form. So I just wanted to make that linkage as well, that there's certainly what can we do when students come to us, and how can we remove barriers and make the process more seamless? And then also, what are ways that when we learn about the challenges students are facing, that we can say, oh, you know what, you might actually also benefit from this other tool. Let us help you through that.
I might add to that too, Laura, with the new FAFSA simplification, the new regulations that when it comes to professional judgment, we will be required to provide the students information that they may submit an appeal, especially income appeals, and as that touches on finances. So what we are doing at my campus, we use a third party called Campus Logic. That's the name of the vendor. And we open it up for all our students, so they could always, when they log in, it's a where they could just submit an appeal if they need to. Again, then on the back end, we screen that, right, to see if it warrants it or not. But at least it's open, and this is where we need to look at our websites to make sure that that information is available to students, that if your family situation has changed or income has changed, you may submit and then explain the process. I like that picture that you have on the slide, Debbie. I'm gonna have to
I'll send that out if people want to.
I like that. I'm gonna have to do that.
Yeah. There's a question that just came in through the Q&A that I'm going to answer again. So somebody just asked about the middle class scholarship. So for those of you at a CSU or UC, saying that when students receive middle class scholarship, sometimes they can have their scholarship reduced or canceled if they accept emergency funds. So I'll just share that there is a bill in the legislature this session to change that policy. So the bill would very specifically say essentially that emergency funds that are received can count towards the student's self-help contribution. And so it doesn't impact the amount of the award that they receive. So it's not the law yet, but I think there's a lot of support in the legislature for making that change. So hopefully you should see that soon. Okay, next question. I want to talk a little bit about policies. And this I'll put to either one of you if you have a response to this. Do you have an example of a policy that was in place at your institution that you identified as problematic, and what you then changed in response to that?
Well, this was many, many years ago, where the institution at the time when I came in, they were verifying students because they have zero income, right? You know, I think that was the most popular policy that's been in place at a lot of colleges, you know, so we have to verify them. And most oftentimes, because we did a study on it, most oftentimes it didn't really affect the students' EFC, what we used to, you know, the effective family contribution. So we gathered the data and then we said, you know, I need to change that. If the student is not verified, why are we verifying someone? So it's an additional step. Again, it's a barrier. At the same time, it's creating a lot of work, administrative work for our office, which we could be concentrating on something else like financial aid outreach. So those are, you know, that's one policy that was changed. That was, like I said, many years ago. And I can, you know, as financial aid administrator, I continue to review policies. And again, you know, when I attend meetings, trainings, webinars like this, I always, you know, someone always brings up an idea. And so I would, you know, talk it with my staff, and if it works, then we implement, right? So there's always room for improvement. So I always think of ways, what can we do that could still be in line? We're still within regulations, right? We're not violating any compliance or regulations. So what can we do to help students and for us too?
Yeah. Jen, how about you?
None at this time that I can think of off the top of my head.
I can add one from the report too that I thought was a helpful practice. So in my conversations with Glendale Community College, they ran data analyses to assess their verification policies. And what they had found was that there was a long-standing policy of verifying all students who met criteria to be independent on the FAFSA for a reason other than age. And so at that time, basically anyone who was getting this like dependency override was getting verified. And what they found was that Latinx and Black students were being disproportionately selected, and yet there was almost negligible change in once the verification process was completed. So that practice has since been repealed. And you know, I think that it's an example of like taking a moment to pause, and just because you have a policy that's been in place for a long time doesn't necessarily mean that it's helpful for the students or the schools.
I understand that. That's a lot of colleges and universities have that policy, and we did have that at one point where, yeah, if the student falls as is considered independent outside of age, we stopped that policy too, because it didn't really affect, you know what I mean, the overall picture. And like Debbie said, you know, there's always that someone, right? I mean, you can't stop. Why penalize the 99% for 1%?
Exactly, and it's a real equity issue as well. So,
Great. I'm going to respond to another question that came in through the Q&A. So there was a question about that I mentioned a policy when I was talking. The policy that I talked about is the new policy related to CalFresh outreach. So the policy is that financial aid offices have to identify students potentially eligible for CalFresh and outreach to those students. And there's no specific requirement that they collaborate with Basic Needs to do that, but it obviously makes a tremendous amount of sense for the financial aid offices to do that in collaboration with financial aid. But the question also was asking about, you know, if you're running into roadblocks in collaboration between financial aid and Basic Needs, is there any regulation or law that requires that collaboration to take place? And the answer to that question is yes. So when AB 132 was adopted, which was the trailer bill language that created the requirement for Basic Needs centers at community colleges, so this is specific to community colleges, it does say, and looking at the language, each Basic Needs center shall coordinate with their campus financial aid department or financial aid office. So it actually is required in law that that collaboration happen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, just so that folks can have our contact information. So this is my contact information and Laura's. And so, you know, if you want me to send you that specific language or something like that, the easiest way to do that is to go ahead and just send an email to me and I can respond to that. But I'm going to close us out with one final question for Anna Faye and Jen, which is, what advice do you have about your basic needs and financial aid departmental collaboration that you think would be helpful for other schools to know as they foster their own partnerships? Jen, do you want to start?
Jen?
Yeah, sure. Advice, right? Stay grounded in the idea that we are here for students, right? We are here to support them, and we get the opportunity to work together and make a change in people's lives. And maybe some conversations might be hard, or you might feel that they're hard, but we're just all people trying to make the student experience better and figure out how we can do that along the way. So just remain open and flexible and student-centered.
I pretty much concur what Jen said, and I'll say in addition to that is have patience. When someone says the barriers, I call them, you know, some challenges, but I call them opportunities as well, right? So just be patient, because change, especially at higher education, does not necessarily happen right away. Relationship building, that takes some time. So the first step, if you know, if it's not in your campus already, is build that, start that, or initiate that relationship building with that other office, right? If you're in financial aid, have that relationship building with basic needs, and then vice versa, right? And continue to talk, open communication, be flexible. Maybe even have a task force maybe later on, and that would be a good opportunity. And I might add, we have here at our college is the student support committee, and financial aid is a resource in that committee, so I'm always in that, and the conversations in that committee always revolve around basic needs. So if you do have a campus committee that involves basic needs or student support, be part of it. Because unfortunately they added financial aid as a resource, and so it's I think one of the voting members, but so you know what I mean. So yeah, so be part of that committee if you have one.
Great. Well, I want to just say a huge thank you to all of our panel members, as well as all of you participating in the webinar and submitting your questions. I do see a question about whether the slides will be shared, and yes, we will send out the slides, a recording to the presentation, as well as the report and some of the other resources mentioned during the presentation. So with that, we're going to close this webinar. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.